The Silent Empire. Elijah Moore had everything the world envied, or so they said. His name was synonymous with success, wealth, and influence. His empire was vast, stretching across continents, built on the foundation of art, rare collections, and priceless masterpieces. He had turned his passion for art into a monumental business, creating an empire so powerful that the name Elijah Moore was spoken with reverence in the most exclusive circles. Auction houses competed for his attention, galleries fought to showcase his collections, and corporate boardrooms trembled when he entered. But the truth was, despite the polished glass walls of his penthouse and the glittering city that lay beneath him, Elijah felt more isolated than ever. Every meeting he attended, every business deal he made, every new piece of art he acquired, it all felt like a mere distraction from the deafening silence that followed him wherever he went. The kind of silence that came with losing something irreplaceable. The kind of silence that no amount of money could fill. Julian, his son, had been his world, his heart, the one person who had given his life true meaning. Julian was supposed to carry the torch, to lead the empire, to bring joy and purpose to the wealth and success Elijah had built. But on a cold winter night, all of that was ripped away. A tragic accident, an unspeakable loss that had left Elijah a shell of the man he once was. The grief that followed had been a monster, one that devoured him piece by piece, leaving only the remnants of a man who had everything yet felt nothing. For 10 years, Elijah had carried the weight of that loss like a chain around his neck. He had turned inward, building his empire higher and higher, as though the walls of his financial fortress could shield him from the pain. But the truth was, every day without Julian felt like a betrayal. Elijah had buried his son in a grave that sat beneath the shadow of the city, but it was his heart that had been buried that day, forever lost to the cold, indifferent world. Every week, without fail, Elijah visited Julian's grave. It was a ritual that had begun shortly after the funeral, a way to pay tribute to the son he could never forget. But over the years, the visits had become more of a mechanical necessity than a genuine expression of grief. It was something Elijah had to do, a responsibility that weighed heavily on his shoulders. He never spoke at the grave, there was no need. What was there to say? The words that had once flowed from his lips like a river of love had long since dried up, leaving behind only silence. He would arrive early in the morning, before the world stirred to life, when the city still slept, and the streets were empty. The peace of the cemetery was the only thing that could temporarily calm the turmoil inside him. He would stand at the grave, looking down at the simple stone that marked Julian's resting place. The flowers he brought, fresh, carefully selected, were always placed with reverence, but the act of doing so felt increasingly hollow as the years passed. It wasn't that he had forgotten Julian. He couldn't forget. But the pain had become so overwhelming, so constant, that it had been easier to build a wall around his heart, to pretend that his son's death was just a part of the past, something he could leave behind with every new acquisition, every new success. But that particular morning, as Elijah stepped out of his car and made his way toward Julian's grave, something felt different. There was a strange tension in the air, a quiet disturbance that sent a shiver down his spine. The cemetery was unusually still, the birds silent, and the wind barely moving the trees. The world felt, held in suspension, as if everything were waiting for something. When Elijah reached the grave, something immediately caught his attention. There was someone there. A figure hunched over the grave, kneeling down with their back to him. At first, Elijah thought it was another mourner, someone who had come to pay their respects. But then, his heart skipped a beat. The person kneeling wasn't an adult, wasn't an older mourner dressed in black like the others who had passed through these gates over the years. No, this figure was a child. A boy, perhaps no older than 12, with dark, unkempt hair that fell in messy waves over his forehead. He wore simple clothes, nothing remarkable, old jeans and a worn t-shirt that looked too big for his slender frame. The boy was placing a bouquet of wildflowers on the grave, arranging them carefully, as though he had done this many times before. There was an almost ritualistic quality to his actions, something that felt so deliberate, so calm, and yet entirely foreign to Elijah. For a long moment, Elijah stood there, unable to move, unable to speak. His mind raced, trying to make sense of the scene before him. Who was this child? What was he doing here? Why was he placing flowers on Julian's grave? Elijah knew every inch of this cemetery, knew who visited and when, and this boy was not someone he recognized. The boy had no business being here. And yet, there he was, as if he belonged. The boy didn't seem to notice Elijah's presence at first. He continued his task, his small hands arranging the flowers with a reverence that struck Elijah as both odd and familiar. There was something about the boy's movements, the way he handled the flowers, that made Elijah's heart ache. It reminded him of Julian, the way his son had once held his hand when they had visited this very grave together, how they had laughed and talked about the world, how everything had felt so simple and full of promise. But now, Julian was gone. And this boy, this stranger, who seemed to know so much about this place. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this encounter than mere coincidence. Who are you? Elijah's voice finally broke through the silence, sharp and unexpected. It came out harsher than he intended, as though he had been holding his breath for far too long. The boy froze for a moment, startled by the sudden question. He looked up, his eyes meeting Elijah's, and for the briefest second, something flickered in his gaze. It was fleeting, too quick to identify, but it was there. A strange recognition. A sense of knowing. I'm just visiting, the boy said quietly, his voice soft and almost apologetic. His eyes darted back to the grave before returning to Elijah. I bring flowers every week. Elijah blinked, the words hitting him harder than he expected. Every week? The boy came here every week? But how could that be? Elijah had been coming for 10 years, and in all that time, he had never seen this boy before. Never. He took a step forward, his mind racing as he tried to process what the boy was saying. Why do you come here? Elijah's voice was gentler now, though still filled with confusion. Why this grave? The boy hesitated, his hands still clutching the stems of the flowers. There was something so calm, so detached in the way the boy spoke, as though he were merely stating a fact. I don't know. I just feel like I have to, the boy said softly, his eyes now locked with Elijah's. I've always come. I bring flowers to honor him. The words, the way he spoke them, made Elijah's chest tighten. Honor him. There was something in the boy's tone, something that didn't belong, and yet, Elijah couldn't deny it. The boy seemed to know something he didn't. For a long moment, the two of them stood there, facing each other across the grave of a boy who had been lost to the world. And in that silence, Elijah felt something stir inside him, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time, hope. The boy blinked and looked down, almost nervously, as if realizing that he was intruding on something sacred. Without another word, he stood up and began to walk away, his footsteps light and quick, fading into the distance. Elijah stood frozen, his mind reeling, his heart pounding in his chest. Who was this boy? Why had he said those words? And why did it feel as though a door had just been opened, one he wasn't sure he was ready to walk through? As the boy disappeared into the distance, Elijah took one last look at the flowers resting on Julian's grave. The wildflowers, vibrant and alive, seemed to speak a language he couldn't understand. And for the first time in years, Elijah didn't feel so alone. Something had shifted. Something was waiting to be discovered. The search. Elijah Moore had spent a lifetime chasing answers. His empire was a direct reflection of his ability to solve problems, to make deals, to overcome any challenge that came his way. Whether it was acquiring a rare piece of art or negotiating the intricacies of international mergers, Elijah thrived on finding solutions. But standing in the cemetery that morning, watching the boy disappear into the trees, he realized there was one mystery he couldn't solve, one puzzle that refused to fit into the logical framework of his existence. The boy. Who was he? Why did he come to Julian's grave every week? And why had Elijah, for the first time in a decade, felt a stirring inside him that he thought had long since died? The questions pounded in Elijah's mind, echoing in the silence of his penthouse long after he had returned from the cemetery. His hands, usually steady, trembled as he poured himself a drink, something strong to dull the gnawing feeling in his chest. But no amount of liquor could quiet the thoughts racing through his head. What if this boy knew something about Julian's death? What if he was connected to the past in a way Elijah hadn't considered? The possibilities were endless, but the only thing Elijah knew for certain was that he needed to find out more. The following morning, Elijah hired a private investigator. A man named Gregor, a former detective who had been with him on numerous occasions when Elijah had needed someone to dig deeper than his own resources allowed. Gregor was a shadow in the underworld of information, able to track down people and details that most would never dream of uncovering. Elijah had always trusted him with the things that mattered most. "I need you to find out everything you can about a boy," Elijah told Gregor over the phone, his voice tight with barely contained urgency. "I don't know his name, but he visits my son's grave every week. I need to know who he is, where he came from, anything about his background." Gregor was quiet for a moment, no doubt processing the unusual nature of the request. "I'll need some more details, Mr. Moore. Do you have a description?" "Dark hair, about 12 or 13. He's been coming to the grave for weeks." "I'm certain of it," Elijah replied, his mind still reeling from the encounter. "He's different, Gregor. There's something about him." "I'll get on it immediately," Gregor said, before hanging up. Elijah spent the rest of the day in a haze, unable to concentrate on anything other than the boy. His empire felt like a distant world, one that existed on the periphery of his thoughts. Meetings were attended, calls were made, but everything seemed distant, a blur of voices and transactions that didn't matter. He couldn't shake the feeling that the boy was important. That something was about to unfold that he couldn't control, no matter how hard he tried. 2 days later, Gregor called. "I've got a lead," Gregor said, his voice steady and matter-of-fact, as always. "The boy's name is Leo. He's 12, lives in the city with his mother. His family isn't well known, but I've found some old records. It looks like his mother worked for a company that used to be tied to your family's art dealings." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. The name Leo rang a bell, but it wasn't the name that struck him most. It was the connection, the faint trace of a thread that tied this boy to his world in a way that felt too deliberate to be a coincidence. How is that possible? Elijah muttered to himself. How could this boy, Leo, have any connection to my family's business? His mother was involved with some of your early acquisitions, Gregor continued. A few pieces that were rare, lost, almost forgotten works of art. She worked with your team on the transactions. After her involvement, she seemed to disappear from the public eye. Elijah leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. His empire had been built on the foundation of rare and exclusive art, and a few of his most treasured acquisitions had come from obscure channels, pieces that were lost to time or buried in private collections. But he couldn't remember anything about this woman, or her connection to Julian. Do you have her name? Elijah asked, his voice tight with impatience. Her name is Maya Ree, Gregor answered. She worked for a consulting firm that assisted in securing art pieces for your collection back when you were just starting to build your reputation. It seems like a distant connection, but I'm certain she was involved. Elijah sat in stunned silence. Maya Ree. He had never heard the name before. But the fact that she was linked to Julian's legacy, even indirectly, made the boy's presence at the grave all the more curious. Find out more about her, Elijah instructed, his mind already spinning with possibilities. And keep digging into Leo. I want to know everything. In the following days, Elijah's obsession with the boy only deepened. Every corner of his life seemed to pull him back to the grave, back to that boy, to the mystery that refused to be unraveled. He visited Julian's grave again, hoping to see the boy there, but Leo was nowhere to be found. The flowers from the previous week still rested on the headstone, a silent reminder that the boy had indeed been there. It was a strange thing, this need that had overtaken Elijah. He had spent a decade building walls around his emotions, convincing himself that grief had no place in a world dominated by power and influence. And yet, here he was, hunting down a boy he had never met, driven by an urgency he couldn't explain. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting an orange glow across the city, Gregor called again. "I've got more on Maya Ree," Gregor said, his voice almost secretive. "It's strange, Elijah. I dug into her background, and there's something odd. She disappeared almost 10 years ago. Right around the same time your son died." Elijah's blood ran cold. The coincidence was too much. His fingers tightened around the phone. "What do you mean, disappeared?" "Gone without a trace," Gregor said. "She was last seen in a hospital, in the city. There's no record of her after that. Some say she left voluntarily. Others say she was involved in some sort of accident. But there's nothing concrete. It's like she vanished into thin air." Elijah's mind reeled, his thoughts crashing together in a chaotic storm. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they didn't make any sense. Maya Ree, connected to the art world, tied to his son's past, disappeared around the time Julian died, and now this boy, Leo, was coming to the grave every week. Could it be possible? Was there a connection between the boy and Julian, some thread that had been buried all these years? "Find Maya," Elijah ordered, his voice sharp. "Find her, no matter what it takes. And get me everything you can on her disappearance." The next few days felt like an eternity. Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening just beyond his reach, something monumental. He had built an empire on the principle that nothing was beyond his control, that every mystery could be solved with enough resources and determination. But this felt different. It wasn't just about money or influence. This was about something deeper, something connected to Julian. And the boy. The boy who had brought flowers to the grave, who felt like a part of something he wasn't supposed to understand. Elijah didn't know whether to be terrified or hopeful, but there was one thing he knew for certain. The answers were out there. And he was going to find them. A revelation. Elijah's search had become an obsession, a relentless drive that consumed every waking moment. It was as though the boy, Leo, had unlocked something deep within him, an ache, a desire to uncover the truth that Elijah had been avoiding for years. Each day he dug deeper, pulling at the threads of his past, of Julian's life, trying to make sense of the strange connection that had inexplicably tied this boy to the grave of his son. But the more Elijah uncovered, the more the questions multiplied. He spent hours on the phone with Gregor, demanding updates, chasing down leads that led nowhere. Maya Ree, the woman connected to the boy, seemed to be a phantom. Every trail led to a dead end, every inquiry brought more confusion. It was as if she had vanished off the face of the earth, leaving only a trail of dust behind. Elijah found himself walking the same path every day, visiting the grave, waiting for the boy to return. But Leo never appeared. It was as though he had disappeared along with the enigma surrounding his existence. Elijah's frustration grew with each passing day, but so did his determination. He could feel that the truth was close, that he was on the cusp of something monumental. He had to find it. He had to know. It was a week after Gregor's last update when Elijah received the call that would change everything. It was late in the evening, the city outside his penthouse shimmering in the soft light of the setting sun. Elijah had just returned from a meeting, yet his mind, as always, was occupied with Leo and Maya. The feeling of impending revelation hung heavy in the air, thickening the space around him like a storm cloud. He couldn't escape it. Every thought, every decision, every breath he took seemed to lead him back to the grave, back to the boy. Gregor's voice on the phone was low, almost cautious. "Elijah, I've found something." Elijah's pulse quickened. "What is it? What did you find?" "There's a connection, something more than just the art dealings," Gregor said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's about Julian." Elijah's breath caught in his throat. "What do you mean, Julian?" He could feel the air in his chest constrict as if the world itself were holding its breath. "I've been going through old records, archives, things related to Maya and her involvement with your collection," Gregor continued, his words now coming faster, as if he were rushing to share something too big to hold in. "It turns out she had a child. Leo. But there's something even stranger." Elijah's mind began to race, his thoughts colliding together in a chaotic frenzy. Maya had a child? Leo? It didn't make sense. "The records are unclear," Gregor said. "But I found a journal entry, something Maya wrote before she disappeared. It's dated just a few months after Julian's death. In it, she talks about the promise she made to a man. She says she was told the child would be part of something greater. That he would be the key to something, but she never explains what. The entry ends abruptly, as though she knew something was about to happen." Elijah felt the room spin, the weight of the revelation bearing down on him like a crushing wave. "The promise? What are you telling me?" "I'm telling you," Gregor said, his voice a mix of excitement and fear, "that Maya may have been carrying Julian's child. It seems that she was pregnant when Julian died." The words hit Elijah like a physical blow. For a moment, he could do nothing but sit in stunned silence. His mind was reeling, grasping at the impossible. How could this be true? Julian, his son, who had died in that tragic accident 10 years ago, was he the father? The idea was absurd, yet the more Elijah considered it, the more it seemed to fit. The boy, Leo. His connection to the grave. His presence, week after week. The journal entry. The promise. Could it be possible that Leo was not just some random child, but Julian's son? Could it be that, in the darkest of circumstances, Julian had left behind a legacy he had never known? And if that was true, what did it mean for Elijah? What did it mean for his grief, his empire, his entire life? "I need to see it," Elijah finally managed to say, his voice hoarse. "Send me everything you have. I want to know everything about Leo. I want to meet him." "I'll get everything to you right away," Gregor replied, a sense of urgency creeping into his voice. "But Elijah, this is bigger than anything we've ever imagined. This could change everything." Elijah hung up the phone, his heart racing in his chest. A part of him wanted to dismiss the possibility, to say that it was too ridiculous to be true. But another part of him, the part that had buried his pain for years, knew that this was the answer he had been searching for. This was the reason why Leo had been coming to Julian's grave, the reason why Elijah had felt so drawn to him. It wasn't just about grief or closure. It was about something far more profound, something that would force Elijah to confront the truth about his son, about his life, and about the future. The following morning, Elijah stood at Julian's grave once again, the cold wind biting at his skin. The cemetery was empty, save for a few early morning walkers and the faint chirping of birds. It had been days since he had last seen Leo, and the silence felt heavy, suffocating. He needed answers. He needed to find the boy. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the journal entry that Gregor had sent him. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded the crumpled paper. The words were smudged in places, as though time and tears had blurred the ink, but he could still make them out. "I promised him," the entry read. "I promised Julian I would protect this child, that he would carry his legacy. But the world will never know. The world can never know what I have done." Elijah felt the air around him shift, as though the world itself was holding its breath. His hands clenched around the paper as he read those words again. Julian had known. He had known that he would leave something behind, something that would be more than just an heir, something that would carry the memory of a life cut short, of a future that never came to pass. And then the final line of the journal entry, the one that seemed to haunt him most: "I will make sure Leo is safe, no matter the cost. He will be the key to all of this." Elijah stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the journal entry, the words swimming before his eyes. The promise. The legacy. The key. In that moment, everything changed. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Gregor continued to dig, uncovering more information about Maya, her disappearance, and the mysterious circumstances surrounding Leo's birth. Elijah couldn't sit still. He had to find the boy, to confront the reality that had been hidden from him for so long. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of waiting, Gregor tracked Leo down. The boy was living with his mother, Maya, in a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city. Elijah had made up his mind: he would meet them. He would face the truth, whatever it was. When the day arrived, Elijah found himself standing in front of the door to the small apartment, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what he was about to face, whether Leo would recognize him, whether Maya would even agree to speak with him, but he knew one thing for certain. He had to know the truth. Maya opened the door slowly when Elijah knocked, her eyes cautious but not entirely unwelcoming. She was older than Elijah had imagined, tired, weathered by years of hiding and running, but there was still a spark of something familiar in her eyes. "Elijah Moore," she said quietly, her voice a mixture of surprise and resignation. "I wasn't expecting you." Elijah swallowed hard, his emotions rising to the surface. "I need to talk to you. About Leo. About Julian." For the first time in years, Elijah felt the weight of his son's death lift slightly, the fog that had surrounded his life beginning to clear. Maya stepped aside, allowing him into the apartment, where Leo sat in the corner, his back to the wall, eyes wide with curiosity. As Elijah met the boy's gaze, everything seemed to fall into place. This was Julian's son. There was no mistaking it, the revelation. Elijah stood in the dimly lit apartment, his gaze fixed on Leo, who sat quietly in the corner. The boy was staring at him, his eyes wide, not with fear, but with curiosity, a strange mixture of recognition and confusion. There was an unspoken understanding in the way Leo held his gaze, a depth in his eyes that felt like a reflection of someone Elijah had lost, someone he thought he would never find again. The room felt small, the walls lined with humble furniture, yet it was suffused with an almost electric tension. Maya stood to the side, her posture tense but controlled, as if she had been waiting for this moment, preparing for it, though Elijah had no idea how long she had known it was coming. "Elijah Moore," Maya said again, her voice tinged with both surprise and resignation. "I didn't think you'd come. I thought you'd stay in your world, your empire of glass and gold." Elijah's throat tightened, and for a moment, he was paralyzed by the weight of her words. He had built that empire, yes. He had lived in that glass fortress, surrounded by art and wealth, power and influence. But none of it had ever mattered as much as what stood before him now. He took a step toward Leo, the boy's eyes never leaving his, and for the first time in 10 years, Elijah felt as though he was truly seeing the world. "I came because I need answers," Elijah said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside him. "I need to know who Leo is. I need to know what happened to Julian." Maya didn't flinch at his words. She had known, Elijah realized, that this day would come. She had known that the secrets of the past would eventually be uncovered, whether through his own search or by some other means. She stepped forward, her face a mixture of determination and sorrow, her eyes flickering with something Elijah couldn't quite decipher. You've already figured it out, haven't you? Maya said quietly, as if she had been waiting for him to arrive at this conclusion. You know who Leo is. Elijah nodded slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no denying it anymore. The boy in front of him, Leo, was his grandson. Julian's son. The child he never knew existed, the child who had been hidden away, lost to him for all these years. Why didn't you tell me? Elijah's voice cracked as he asked the question, his anger rising in a torrent of emotion that had been buried for too long. Why didn't you tell me that Julian had a son? Why keep him from me? Maya's eyes softened with a pain that seemed to mirror Elijah's own. I didn't keep him from you, Elijah. I kept him from the world. From your world. From the things that destroyed Julian. From the things that took him away from us. Her words hit him like a slap to the face. He had always thought of himself as a protector, as the one who would ensure his son's legacy endured. Yet, here was Maya, a woman he had never fully understood, standing before him, holding the truth that had been kept from him for a decade. Julian knew what would happen, Maya continued, her voice breaking with the weight of her confession. He knew he was at risk, that the world would never let him have a normal life. That his position, the empire you built, would consume him just like it consumed you. He didn't want Leo to grow up in that world. He wanted him to be free. To have a chance at a life without the shadows of what you built hanging over him. Elijah's mind spun. He had never thought of Julian that way, had never understood how much of a burden his success had placed on his son's shoulders. Julian had been a bright, vibrant child, a boy full of potential, of dreams. To think that the world his father had built, this world of wealth and influence, of gallery auctions and endless meetings, had become a prison to him, had driven him to make the decision to hide his own son away, was a truth Elijah had never dared confront. But why now? Elijah asked, his voice shaking. Why didn't you bring Leo to me after Julian was gone? Why keep him hidden from me all these years? Maya took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she ran them over her face. Because I was afraid, Elijah. Afraid that if you knew about Leo, you would want to drag him into the same world that tore Julian apart. The same world that cost him his life. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let you take him from me. She looked down at Leo, her eyes filled with both love and sorrow. The boy had been silent throughout the entire conversation, watching, absorbing, as if he had been waiting for something to unfold. He looked up at his mother, then at Elijah, his gaze intense and calculating, far older than his years. Elijah, Maya said, her voice soft, Leo is the future that Julian wanted but never had. He is the one who can break free from the chains of the past. I didn't want him to be a pawn in your empire. I wanted him to have a choice. The weight of her words hung heavy in the room. Elijah had always seen the world in terms of control, control over his empire, control over his wealth, control over every aspect of his life. But now, standing here, face to face with the boy who had never had a choice in any of it, Elijah realized how hollow that control had been. I never knew, Elijah's voice faltered. I never knew Julian wanted that. That he wanted something different for Leo. I never understood that. Maya stepped closer to him, her eyes never leaving his. You never did, Elijah. You never understood because you were too busy building your empire. Julian wanted to be free, but you made it impossible for him to escape. And now, Leo. Leo deserves the freedom Julian never had. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Elijah could feel the weight of everything pressing on him, his past, his mistakes, the legacy he had built, the empire that had come at such a great cost. And standing before him now was the only piece of his son's legacy that remained, the only one that could undo the damage he had caused. The boy, his grandson, was the key to everything, to the future that Julian had dreamed of. Finally, Leo stood up. He was small, but his presence in the room was commanding. He walked slowly toward Elijah, his eyes never leaving the older man's face. The silence stretched between them like an invisible thread, one that connected them in ways that words could not explain. "You're my grandfather, aren't you?" Leo asked quietly, his voice soft but steady, as if he had already known the answer. His gaze flicked toward Maya for a moment before returning to Elijah. "I don't know if I want to be part of your world. I don't know if I want the legacy you've built." Elijah swallowed hard, his heart sinking as he heard Leo's words. He had always imagined that, if this day ever came, it would be filled with joy, with reunion. But instead, it felt like a reckoning. Leo didn't want this world. And why should he? What had this world given him? What had it given Julian? "I understand," Elijah said finally, his voice breaking through the tension. "I understand, Leo. I never wanted to trap you in the world I created. I never wanted to turn you into something you're not. But I'm here now. I'm here because I want you to have a choice. I want you to know the truth, no matter how painful it is. You don't have to be part of my world, but you should know what it is. You should know who you are. And maybe, just maybe, you'll be able to make a choice of your own." Leo looked at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Elijah's face. And in that moment, Elijah realized that this was the most important thing he could offer, the truth, and the choice that Julian never had. "Maybe one day," Leo said quietly, "I'll decide. But for now, I need to figure out who I am first." Elijah nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. The truth had come at a great cost, but it was here now, standing before him in the form of a boy he barely knew, but who had already become the bridge between the past and the future. A future that, for the first time in years, felt full of possibilities. "I'll be here," Elijah said softly, his voice steady with resolve. "Whenever you're ready. I'll be here." As Leo turned back toward Maya, Elijah felt something shift inside him. The burden of the past, the weight of his mistakes, still hung heavy in his heart, but he knew that this was the beginning of something new. A chance to make things right, not for himself, but for Leo, for Julian, and for the legacy that had been hidden for far too long. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to change the course of their lives. The path forward. The days following Elijah's meeting with Maya and Leo were a blur of emotions, confusion, and a quiet, simmering determination. Elijah had never felt more lost and more certain in his entire life. The weight of the truth hung heavy around him, but for the first time, it felt like the burden was no longer just his to bear. The legacy that Julian had left behind, the empire built on art and influence, was no longer just a symbol of Elijah's success. It was a symbol of his failure, a failure to truly understand the son he had lost and the world he had forced him to inherit. Now, Leo, the boy who had somehow remained a ghost in the shadows of his son's life, was standing in front of him, a tangible link to everything he had lost and everything he had failed to protect. It had been 3 days since he had left Leo's apartment. 3 days of restless nights and endless thoughts. Despite his best efforts to focus on his work, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at a crossroads, with the road to the future lying uncertain and tangled ahead. He had never faced anything like this, and the empire he had spent his life building seemed so distant now, as if it no longer held the answers to the questions that consumed him. Each morning, he would return to the cemetery. He visited Julian's grave with more intensity than before, feeling as though the weight of his son's absence pressed down on him even harder. Julian's grave was still there, still marked with the wildflowers that Leo had placed. But now, it felt less like a place of mourning and more like a place of reckoning, a reminder of all the things Elijah had never seen, all the ways he had failed Julian in life. But there was something else, something far more powerful, beginning to emerge in the midst of his grief. It wasn't just the overwhelming pain of losing Julian, it was the stirring sense of hope, of possibility, that Leo had unexpectedly brought into his life. Elijah had not been prepared for it, but now, he couldn't deny it. This boy, who had grown up in the shadow of his family's legacy, was not a symbol of failure. He was a chance to make something right. He was Julian's chance at a life he had never been able to live, and Elijah's chance to rebuild, not just his empire, but his relationship with his son, a son he hadn't truly understood until now. Maya had been hesitant to allow Elijah near Leo again, especially so soon after the revelation that had come so unexpectedly. She was protective of Leo, as she should have been, and Elijah could sense the hesitation in her every word when they spoke on the phone. But something inside her had changed, too. She saw the same quiet determination in Elijah that she had once seen in Julian. It was a determination that, for the first time, seemed genuine. Maya had her doubts about Elijah, about whether he truly understood the cost of his own success, whether he had the capacity to offer Leo the life he deserved. But she also saw something else. She saw a man who had, for the first time, acknowledged his mistakes. And she saw a chance to change the trajectory of Leo's life, just as Julian had once tried to do. After days of careful consideration, Maya agreed to allow Elijah to meet Leo again. But this time, there would be no grand gestures, no promises made. Elijah would have to prove, through his actions, that he could be trusted. Elijah agreed, knowing that this would be a long journey, one he would have to take slowly and carefully, one step at a time. It was a chilly afternoon when Elijah made his way to Leo's apartment again. This time, he wasn't just there to apologize. He was there to begin something that had been in the shadows for far too long. He arrived early, just as he had on the day he had first learned about Leo. But this time, there was no confusion, no urgency. There was only a quiet determination to show the boy, the grandson he had never known, that he was ready to be a part of his life. Maya opened the door, her expression guarded but not hostile. "He's inside," she said simply, stepping aside to let Elijah in. Leo was sitting on the couch, reading a book. When he saw Elijah, his expression remained neutral, but there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Elijah didn't speak right away. Instead, he stood there, watching the boy for a moment, trying to make sense of everything, the connection, the lost years, the truth about Julian. Finally, after a long silence, Leo put his book down and looked at Elijah. "I don't know what you want from me," he said, his voice steady but wary. "I don't know if I can just forgive all of this. Everything that's happened." Elijah nodded, his throat tight. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Leo. I'm asking for a chance. A chance to prove to you that I can be someone you trust, someone who won't force you into a world you don't want. I never wanted to hurt your father, and I don't want to make the same mistakes again." Leo didn't say anything for a long time, just looked at him with those quiet, piercing eyes. He was silent, as if weighing Elijah's words carefully. Then, finally, he spoke again. "You're right. You can't change the past. But maybe you can make things better for the future." Elijah felt something stir in him at those words. They weren't a promise, but they weren't rejection either. Leo wasn't ready to forgive, but he wasn't closing the door entirely. That was a start. "I want to try," Elijah said softly. "I want to help you. I want to show you a different path. But I can't do that alone. I need you to be a part of this." Leo stared at him for a moment longer, as though considering what Elijah had said. Then, finally, he nodded. "Okay. But it's going to take time." "I understand," Elijah replied, his heart filled with both relief and a deep sadness. "I'll take whatever time you need." In the weeks that followed, Elijah began to slowly rebuild his relationship with Leo. It wasn't easy. Trust was fragile, and the scars of the past ran deep. But with each passing day, they found common ground. They talked, not just about Julian, but about everything. About the life Leo had lived, about the things he wanted and the things he feared. And slowly, Elijah began to understand the boy in a way he never could have before. Leo was a reflection of Julian, but he was also his own person, his own spirit, his own identity. Elijah couldn't control that, and he shouldn't have. But he could be a part of it. He could help Leo find his way, help him build a life that wasn't tethered to the mistakes of the past. One evening, a few weeks into their new arrangement, Elijah took Leo out to dinner. They ate at a small, unassuming restaurant on the edge of the city, nothing like the exclusive places Elijah usually frequented, but exactly what Leo had wanted. It was an unremarkable place, but to Elijah, it felt like the most important meal of his life. As they ate, they talked, the conversation flowing more easily than it ever had before. They spoke of art, of music, of books and films, and of the things that made Leo's world feel alive. Elijah learned more about Leo in one evening than he had learned in all the years he had been searching for him. And for the first time, he saw the future, not as a continuation of his empire, but as something more meaningful. Something that didn't have to be bound by the walls of wealth and power. When the meal was over, they walked outside into the cool night air. Elijah looked at Leo, who had grown quiet again, as if lost in thought. "I know I can't change what's happened," Elijah said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But I can be here for you. I can help you build your future, if that's what you want." Leo didn't answer right away. But when he finally spoke, his words were simple, yet they carried a weight that echoed in Elijah's chest. "I don't know what I want yet. But I'll figure it out. And I won't be alone when I do." Elijah smiled softly, a mixture of pride and pain flooding through him. He didn't have all the answers, and he didn't expect Leo to have them either. But for the first time in years, Elijah felt a sense of peace, a quiet optimism that, together, they could figure out the path forward. And that, no matter what, they would do it together. As they walked down the street, the distant city lights flickering in the background, Elijah realized that the future, for the first time in a long time, felt full of possibilities. The beginning of a new legacy. The weeks that followed marked the beginning of a quiet transformation. Elijah and Leo's relationship, though still fragile, grew in subtle ways. They spent time together, mostly in simple, unpretentious moments that didn't demand anything from either of them, but simply allowed them to exist side by side. It was the opposite of the grand gestures Elijah had once relied on to maintain control. There were no expectations, no pressure to immediately heal the wounds of the past. It was slow, steady work, but it was real. Maya watched from a distance, cautious but cautiously hopeful. She had seen a change in Elijah, but her guard remained up. She was still protecting Leo from the world Elijah had been a part of, the same world that had once taken so much from Julian. Elijah understood that, and in many ways, he respected her for it. She wasn't ready to fully trust him, and that was okay. What mattered now was the small steps, those moments of connection that, while fragile, were beginning to form a foundation. One evening, as the light from the setting sun spilled into Elijah's penthouse, he found himself thinking about his past, not just the empire he had built, but the choices he had made. The ones that had led him down a path where power and influence had come at the expense of the things that truly mattered. But there, in the quiet of his apartment, surrounded by priceless works of art, Elijah had never felt more empty. These objects, these achievements, were nothing but reminders of a life he had constructed to protect himself from the truth. But now, that truth was standing before him in the form of Leo, and Elijah couldn't hide behind his empire any longer. Elijah had been thinking about the future for days. The future of his empire, yes, but more importantly, the future of his son's legacy, what remained of it, and what could be passed on. Leo was his grandson, Julian's son, but more than that, he was the living embodiment of a dream Julian had never been able to fulfill. It had been clear from the first moment Leo had spoken to him that this boy, despite his reluctance to be part of the world Elijah had built, was more than just a symbol. He was a person with his own potential, his own desires, his own path to follow. Elijah stood before his desk in the penthouse, his hand resting on the edge of an ancient leather-bound ledger, a relic from his early days when the empire had only been a series of humble investments and acquisitions. His eyes scanned the pages, names, dates, collections, decisions that had shaped the course of his life. The legacy of his work, the empire, had grown into something monumental, but there was a part of him that wondered what it would mean if he didn't pass it on in the way he had always assumed he would. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He knew it was Leo before he even answered. "Come in," Elijah said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet anticipation. The door opened, and Leo stepped in, his hands tucked into the pockets of his jacket. He looked older than his years, the weight of what he had been through settling quietly on his young shoulders. There was something different about him now, Elijah noticed, something more grounded. He wasn't the same boy who had been wary and distant when they first met. There was a new sense of calm in his eyes, an acceptance of who he was, and what the world had offered him. Elijah didn't wait for Leo to speak. "I've been thinking about the future," he began, turning away from the ledger and meeting the boy's gaze. "About what comes next. Not just for me, but for you." Leo raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "What do you mean?" Elijah leaned against the desk, his fingers brushing lightly over the ledger. "I've spent my whole life building this empire, Leo. Art, acquisitions, wealth, it's all become my identity. But I've realized that none of it matters without the right people to pass it on to. I've built something, yes, but I've also lost something along the way. I've lost connection. I've lost family." Leo said nothing, but his expression softened slightly, as if he understood something Elijah wasn't saying directly. "I don't expect you to take over everything, Leo," Elijah continued. "I don't expect you to follow the same path I did. That would be unfair. But I want to offer you a choice. A real choice. You can take part in this world if you want, or you can walk away from it. It's yours to decide. But whatever you choose, I want to help you find your way. I want to support you in whatever you want to do, whether it's running this empire or creating something entirely different. It's your future, Leo. Not mine." Leo stood still for a long moment, looking at Elijah as if weighing his words carefully. The silence between them felt heavy, but in a way that didn't suffocate. It was a silence that invited thought, reflection, and, in time, understanding. "I don't know what I want yet," Leo said at last, his voice steady but thoughtful. "But I'm willing to figure it out. With your help." Elijah nodded, a sense of relief flooding through him. This wasn't about fixing everything overnight, but it was a step in the right direction. It was the beginning of something that could, perhaps, be better than what had come before. Over the next few months, Elijah worked alongside Leo in a way that felt more like partnership than obligation. They spent their time visiting various art galleries and auctions together, Elijah showing Leo the finer details of the business, but never pushing him to accept it. They discussed everything from business strategy to philosophy, from world events to dreams of the future. Leo had an open mind, eager to learn but also determined not to be bound by his grandfather's world. Maya, still cautious, began to see the positive effects of their growing relationship. While she hadn't fully embraced the idea of Elijah taking such an active role in Leo's life, she could see the boy changing, becoming more confident, more self-assured. Leo no longer seemed like someone burdened by the past. Instead, he had begun to see the possibilities of his own future. Elijah, for his part, was learning just as much as Leo. He was learning to let go of his need for control, to allow Leo the space to grow into himself. He was learning that true leadership didn't come from power, it came from understanding, from compassion, from offering others the freedom to forge their own path. One evening, as they sat together in the penthouse overlooking the city, Elijah spoke to Leo again, this time about something that had been weighing on his mind. You know, Leo, Elijah said, when Julian died, I thought everything would collapse. I thought the world would come to an end. But I've come to realize that it's not about the empire I built. It's about the people we choose to be, and the legacy we leave through our actions. Leo turned to him, his eyes thoughtful. Is that why you didn't want to pass this empire on to me? Because you thought I'd be trapped in it? Elijah hesitated for a moment, considering his words. It's part of the reason. But mostly, I didn't want you to feel like you had no choice. Like everything was predetermined for you. You have the right to make your own decisions, Leo. You deserve to have a future that's yours, not one that's imposed upon you. Leo nodded slowly, a faint smile crossing his lips. I get that. But you've given me something valuable, even if I don't know what to do with it yet. You've shown me that it's okay to choose my own path, and that it's okay to take my time. Elijah felt a rush of emotion, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Pride. Hope. A sense of peace. I'm glad to hear that. And no matter what path you choose, I'll be here. I'll support you. As time passed, Leo continued to explore his own passions. He still spent time with Elijah, learning about the art world and the complexities of business, but he also began to delve into other areas, literature, music, and even environmental science. Leo had a sharp mind and an open heart, and his interests were as diverse as they were deep. Elijah watched with quiet pride as the boy carved his own identity, one step at a time. Eventually, Leo decided that he would continue his education, pursue his own dreams, and create something new, something that would bear his name and carry forward the lessons of the past without being chained to them. It wasn't an easy decision, and there were moments of doubt along the way, but in the end, Leo knew that he had the support of the one person who mattered most, his grandfather. Elijah, for the first time in years, felt a sense of contentment settle over him. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: it was no longer defined by the walls of his empire. It was defined by the relationship he had rebuilt with his grandson, by the chance to make things right, and by the understanding that the future was never set in stone. It was a journey, one that Leo would walk on his own terms, with Elijah there to support him. Not as a dictator, but as a partner. And in that, Elijah finally found the peace he had been searching for all along.